All right, as you can see, if you want to follow along, if you go in the bulletin, there's a little bit of a capture sheet, fill in the blanks. You'll see it's much shorter than normal. Not because Jake's not here, it's just because if you've never been here on this day before, Sunday before Thanksgiving, we give time for people to share out moments of thanks. So we want to leave some time for that. So that's why we have that. But just I wanted to do a little short, I guess, more of a devotional, but in this case, we see it's called The Secret of Contentment. And we're looking at Philippians, kind of the end of the book. It's got 4 chapters. It was a letter written by Paul to the church of Philippi while he was in prison. And he was in prison, this was later in his life. He was imprisoned for basically spreading Christianity, preaching the gospel. He ended up in Rome. If you're familiar, we went through the book of Acts not too long ago, where Paul he appealed to Caesar when he was in Jerusalem because the British leaders there wanted to kill him, and he appealed to Caesar because of the accusations, and he went to Rome, and eventually he was able to preach there and share the good news there while he was in Rome, but then eventually he was ended up put in prison. And if you know anything about prison back then, it wasn't you got a nice place to sleep, 3 meals a day. You were dependent on people outside the prison to support you. And this letter basically, if we look, this whole letter is a letter of thanks. So if you see kind of that first, it's basically a giant note of thankfulness that Paul gave to the church of Philippi. In the beginning of the book, it starts off in verses 3 through 5, and you have to apologize here. Teaching on Zoom 5 years ago doomed my eyes to close reading here, so. But I can see you in the back, so if you're falling asleep, you can't get away with it, all right? But it says in chapter 1, verse 3, he says, I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, for you all making my prayer with joy, because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. And later in the book, and I don't have this up there, near the end of the book of Philippians, the letter, he thanks the church of Philippi for their generous gifts over the years. They were one church that was supporting him monetarily, and they didn't have a lot, but they gave what they could. And in this case, Paul was thanking them for their generous gift throughout the years of his service while he was preaching out on the road, sharing the good news of Jesus. So, and then later it's interesting, even though he was in prison, also after this later in the book, he tells the church to rejoice in the Lord always, despite any circumstances, to not be anxious despite the circumstances. So here Paul, a guy in prison, like, wow, what do you have to be thankful for, Paul? Yet he was overflowing with thanks for this church and what they did for him, and of course, more importantly, to God. So I want to take a look at just the kind of last 4 verses near the end of the book, starting with verse 10 in chapter 4. So if you're following with us, if not, it'll be up on the screen. It says, I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I now know how it is to be brought low. I know how it is to abound in any and every circumstance. I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger without having Wi-Fi. Oh, wait, that's not there, sorry. Abundance and needs. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So at the end, and perhaps you're familiar with this last verse, a lot of times you hear this quoted at verse 13, but we heard earlier about that advertisement for the Bible Pathways class and kind of looking at the Bible, interpreting it. And I know there's a Sunday school class of women's, they've been going through interpreting in the Bible. And sometimes that verse, I think this verse is taken out of context, like, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can leap Niagara Falls. No, that's not what he's talking about here, right? But we're going to see later what that is. But I want to make the point that in here, where Paul was thankful, that someone that's thankful is a content person. Right? You don't see people that are unthankful. Oh, I wish I had this. They're not content, right? But someone that's thankful is a content person. So, I guess what is the secret of contentment? And I want to share kind of 3 quick points here. So the first point is that contentment, basically circumstances don't have to affect our contentment. Right? In this case, Paul, with the circumstances that he was in. Interesting, the word content from the Greek, it comes from a word meaning self-sufficient independency. Now, you may think, wait, that means we look at a self-sufficient, I can do anything, I don't need anybody, I don't need anybody's help. No, that's not what this is talking about here. It's talking about that you have all you need independent of the circumstances. So in this case, right, so Paul had said later on, he said, I have found what he needed most, right? He didn't need money, he didn't need fame, he didn't need his freedom. He found something that he didn't need anything else for. And I see this when you read stories, especially about the persecuted church, where, you know, what they're going through, especially in Nigeria right now. And yet, those people, if you ever listen, they're one of the most content people. You know, they're content. They're thankful for what God's given despite these circumstances that are dire, that we can't even imagine what they're going through. Yet they're content. And I would say, especially with Paul, is saying if circumstances affect our contentment, it's because we're focused more on what we lack than what we have, right? So I guess the next point in this case is that if we read verses 11, 12, he said, I have learned to be content. So in this case, Paul chose, right? He didn't say, right. We can choose to learn contentment ourselves. It's not natural, is it? Right? Just look at maybe a child. I mean, my kids are older now, but you're like, oh, a child playing with a toy. They don't want any other toy, but they want that one that other child has, right? I want that one, right? They're not content. Sometimes we also see, too, that, you know, if I only had this, if I only had the new car, if I only had the new phone. And it's funny, I was back when the kids could have their phones in school. Sorry, that's not a dig. Sorry, kids. But when I was working, the kids would make fun of my phone. They're like, oh, Miss Susan, you should get this phone. But at the same time, I didn't grow up with that, and boy, it was meeting my needs. I was content with it. But, you know, they jokingly mock, you know, you got this little phone, Mr. Sicienski. But in this case, I was content with what I had because I knew what I didn't have. And, you know, this is just amazing to be able to, you know, obviously look up. But also maybe if we could go back to, well, we've seen that people that aren't content, or in the past, some bad things have happened, right? Go way back to the beginning. Lucifer, who we know is a devil, right? He wasn't content being lower than God, right? He wanted to be God. Adam and Eve, right? They wanted more. They wanted to know more. They wanted to, oh, why did God say this, right? And not being content, what happened? Well, obviously some terrible things, right? But I'm encouraged with regards to contentment. I have a friend who about 2 years ago was in a really bad car accident. And he took a little while, he recovered, but then he went back into, and he's been in a, basically, you know, a rehab facility for over a year. He has not been out. And I was able to go visit him about a month ago. But when we talk on the phone, he's the one that, boy, this is just a terrible circumstance. You're stuck in this facility because, one, he doesn't have a job, but also waiting on, if you know, government insurance and all that, that can be on Social Security disability. But he's saying, hey, I've got 3 meals, I've got a bed, I've got a place to lay my head. And it's just like, wow, just that, you know, just what he's going through yet, because he's a Christian, thankfully. But he can take this, and he's known what Paul known. Like, he's had plenty, but now obviously he doesn't. But through God's strength and God's provision through his life, he sees that, you know, I do have everything I need, and that's Jesus. And again, things have gotten a little better, but, you know, still praying and hoping that, you know, he'll be able to be out of there soon. But again, just the example that he's set, and just, again, amazing. Again, only can do it through God's strength. And lastly, we're near the end of this little passage here. that verse that sometimes is taken out of context, but the last point here is that true contentment requires nothing more than knowing Jesus. Here, Paul, right? He talked about, in this case, my God. Later on, he goes, "My God will supply all your needs according to His riches and glory." But here, he's talking about how that in this case, he's fallen. He's had a lot. He's been low. He was if you're familiar with Paul, right? He was beaten up, thrown in prison, starved. Yet, he kept going. He kept seeing that, that he could do all things through Christ, right? And this is case. So I would challenge again that contentment is being thankful where God has already done, rather than spending the energy wishing for other things, right? And we look at this last verse in verse 13. I kind of put it up there again so we see that. But this verse is more about God's ambitions or purposes for us. That God will give us everything we need to do the things He wants us to do. And also I look at it as a promise that as we pursue God's purpose for our lives, that we'll find contentment and peace, that we can endure any kind of hardship. And I see that in my friend's life. You see that throughout, with Christians throughout the world that are being persecuted. I also, too, just another personal story in my life is I've applied for a lot of positions in my district, and I've pretty much been turned down every time. And for whatever reasons, I don't know, some I do, but there was one scenario most recently where I was turned down. I was like, but at the same time, I've been turned down so many times, and I've seen God working through those times. Like, okay, Mike, you didn't get this, and I saw later on why I didn't get that, and it was a good thing. In this other case, I was turned down, and I had some friends of mine that were mad that I got turned down. But at my save, from all this, that God had this peace on me, and I was like, okay. But they were madder than, I was like, okay, this happens. Next thing up. But I see like a year or two down the road that this job was actually pretty miserable, the people in there. And I was like, here you go again, God. You protected me. You didn't give me what I thought I wanted. And again, that God is, He's obviously so much smarter than us. He sees His reasons. But I think in this area anyways, He's helped me to build a little contentment. Yes, I have so much still to learn, like that little green sage. Much to learn, have you? But Yoda, if you're wondering. But again, that that there's so much for me to still learn. But God taught me, okay, I say no. There's a reason, right? And again, I thank God that, okay, thank you, God, I didn't get that job. I'm glad I didn't, or I didn't get that position. But perhaps, He's building something for me for the future. I don't know. But again, that we can trust God, that we can, that no matter what, the most important part here is that that we learn contentment, right? And that when we're content, we can see that we have an attitude of thankfulness, just like Paul did. Yeah, that's supernatural thankfulness that, that the world can't explain.